Now let's aggressively search for some inefficiencies in the process. What I'm going to do is I'm going to search for repeated steps. Now before we look for repeated steps, I just want to highlight these arrows that we see, the gray and the black arrows, they represent aggregations of cases. So for example, 81 cases went down this particular path. 355 cases went from opportunity to quote. These are aggregations. Many of them are represented by a single arrow. When I do the analysis and look for some of those inefficiencies, we're going to see cases of red arrows appearing. And a red arrow represents the one offending case that we're examining. So right now we're looking for the worst offender for repeated steps. Now, when we look at this, the red arrow is appearing, and next to the red arrow we see a number, in this case number 1. That represents the first thing that happened for this particular case. So we're seeing the first thing was somebody created a quote. The second thing was that somebody created an order. Then the third thing, that order got changed. Now if I open up this window, we see that order got changed again and again and again. These concentric circles here represent that there was a change following a change following a change. So when I talked to the business and we said, look, okay, order change is part of the process, but are you serious about making this many changes? It turned out this was actually 120 changes for one particular order. Now, when I showed this to the client, it was like, well, yeah, we change orders, but not that much. It can't be right. This can't be possible. But remember, this is based on process evidence. So we have the ability to go in there and say, well, I can show you exactly the details for this particular case. I can show you the quote number, I can show you the order number, I can show you when it was placed, what the sales organization was, all that kind of information was there, as well as all the timestamps related to that particular case as well. So we're seeing here, order got changed on May 15th, then it got changed on June 12th, July 2nd, July 26th, and so on. So the full evidence, all the breadcrumbs are there that can prove and give us an ego-free way of saying, look, this really happened. Now let's have a look and try and figure out exactly why this took place. Allow us to examine the scenario for this case and design that into the improved process going forward. Now with this particular client, while I was talking to them, they logged into their SAP environment and started looking up the particular case, and they looked up this order number and they said, oh yeah, we remember this case. This was one of our famous problematic clients who and they required a lot of change. Now the key was they knew that from their knowledge of working within the company, whereas from Fujitsu's perspective, we'd only been in there for a couple of days and we'd automatically been able to quickly pinpoint this as one of the worst cases of following the process for them. And we did that without the knowledge and all the background of what was happening in their environment. Now, they said, yes, we understand this was the worst case. But then I turned it around and asked them, well, okay, that was the worst case. Who was your second worst case client? They didn't really have a good answer. From our side, we can go and say, here's the next worst case. And the next. And we can keep going on and show them case after case after case. These are individual cases of the worst case for repeated steps. Now this particular example that's on the screen right now, this is actually a good example of a loopback. Now a loopback is where the process flows forward and then for some reason it loops back to an earlier step in the process. So we're now seeing these arrows between quote change and order. We're seeing them going back and forth, back and forth. What's happening here is that somebody's getting a quote, they're changing it, they're sending it forward to an order. Now, when the order is created, the manufacturing guys are going off and starting to procure parts and build the system that they need to ship. But what's actually happening is they're getting this order, and then for some reason somebody's going and changing the quote again. They're going back in time. So now the manufacturing guys are building something that's different to what the customer actually wants. So being able to highlight these kind of cases is also very powerful for showing them loopbacks in the process. Now what we're going to do is we're going to slice and dice the process by various attributes. Now when we were looking at the data or the evidence for that repeated step case, we saw that there was a sales office recorded in there. what I'm going to do is I'm going to slice and dice the process to see how it was performed by the sales office. So let me slice by sales office, and what we're going to see is we're going to see all the sales offices that are involved. I'm going to look at show me the processes for sales office 1000. I'm going to see that one. Now also what I'm going to do is I'm going to say show me the process. Let's compare side by side. Let's compare the processes for let's take, what is this one, 3040 3010. Now 3010 was a different group, and let's look at these side by side. So now on the left hand side we're seeing process 3010. On the right hand side we're seeing sales office 1000, sorry, and on the left hand side was sales office 3010. Now we now have the ability to see differences in the process that's being performed based on these attributes that we're slicing and dicing by. So we can look at it and say, okay, are there any, there might be intentional differences or desired differences because there might be compliance reasons between the two different sales offices, or maybe they're supposed to be the same but for some reason they're not. So we have the ability to, at a side-by-side, look at these processes and say, okay, why is one group taking half a day for a particular step, whereas the other group is taking 1.5 days for that same step? What can we learn from this? What can we learn, from a best-of-breed perspective? One of our groups might be the best-of-breed or the recognized good department that's doing it right or very successful. Now, what can we learn from that? Can we see how they do this process and replicate that to other departments or other divisions? So being able to compare is very critical for finding out what are the successful factors for delivering good results within the organization. So now we've looked at the information about comparing processes. Now earlier on I talked about being able to explore KPIs like cycle time or the cost of processes. Now, before I look at that, I'm going to push this up to 100% so we can see all of the data, all of the routes, and let's do some route analysis based on that. And we'll do the route analysis based on those KPIs like cycle time or cost. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to sort based on frequency first. We're going to see the route that takes place most frequently is the one that happens 268 times. Unfortunately, it's the case that happened where an opportunity is created and it doesn't go anywhere. Now, that by itself is saying a lot. It says, hey, most of the time we're getting these opportunities and not capitalizing on them. So that's giving us information as well. But if we sort based on average time, we can start looking at it and say, okay, we're now looking at a case that the average time was 1,099 days. Hey, what's going on with this? The tool immediately allows us to see which of those steps took a long time. Here's a step that took 156 days. Here's another step, 756 days. Allows us to drill down and focus and say, well, why did those particular steps take so long? We also have the ability to sort based on cost. Now, here it's showing us the most expensive process that we took cost us $4,700. Now, if you're selling a $10,000 widget, you don't want to be spending $4,700 performing the sales process. So having this kind of KPI, if your goal is to reduce cost, then you can look at this and say, okay, these are the routes that happened. This was the most expensive route for me. Find out where my cost was happening. And so that gives us good indication. And in this case, we see that there's a high frequency here for this order change following an order change. That's one of the ones that's accounting for this large cost that's happening here. So all of these things can give us the ability to see where our costs are slowly building up. Here's that order change with all the repeated steps behind it. To show us the cases of where are we losing money, where are we having margin getting eroded by these invisible costs that happen of performing the process behind the scenes. And remember, as with all parts of automated process discovery, the underlying data is always available, and so we can always show that and say, well, this was the exact case that we were looking at. This was the quote number. This is when it happened. all that information is available.